I would love if you could just explain the premise of the book and what led you to writing it.
Clinical depression, as most people know it, is when people have these symptoms such as low concentration, poor sleep, not feeling hungry or changes in appetite, changes in your mood, so like feeling sad, and also something called anhedonia, which is a lack of interest and pleasure in things that once really lit you up and brought you joy. However, using the DSM-5, which is the Bible of psychiatry that I use in my research and my private practice every day, under that, if you have these symptoms of depression, but you still are functioning, or you're not in like significant distress, you technically don't have clinical depression.
Oh.
But what I was seeing after 2020 was a lot of people coming in having these symptoms of depression, but over-functioning, meaning they were like showing up. They were the rocks. They were overperforming.
Mm-hmm.
And that was their way of dealing with their depression. But there was no place for them in this Bible of psychiatry. So that led me to think, okay, I wonder how many people out there are experiencing this. And there was a real need to study it. Most of my colleagues were saying, oh, high-functioning depression, that's not real. You know, clinical, regular depression is more important. And I thought, well, if we're only waiting for people to break down to intervene, then we're just like missing the boat.
Yes.
Why don't we prevent this from happening? And that led me to conduct the first ever peer-reviewed study in the world on high-functioning depression that was published. And I've had fascinating findings, and I just wanted to share that with the world.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I actually had somebody on that was sharing about high-functioning codependency recently. And I think people can really relate to the idea of showing up even more and trying to busy yourself when you are feeling certain feelings. And when you think of depression, you know, in my mind, it's don't want to wake up in the morning, don't want to see anyone. You know, the way that you imagine someone who is depressive to be would be in the stereotypical way. But, you know, when I've heard about people committing suicide or the shocks that you have of people, you're like, wait, they didn't look depressed at all.
Mm-hmm.
They were showing up to work, they were dancing, they were happy, they were laughing. And so when I read the book, I was like, I feel like there's probably more people out there with high functioning depression than there are people who are actually showing up in the traditional way that you see depression being.
Yeah, I think you're right. Think about the queue in line. If you think about people breaking down and then people having these symptoms but over-functioning and showing up, it makes sense that there would be more people in the queue, right? And spot on with busying yourself. One of the findings in my study was a high correlation with trauma. And in my trauma research, when people want to avoid processing pain, what do? They busy themselves. They distract themselves. So the classic avoidance you see in PTSD is not wanting to be around the situations, the people, the places that trigger you. But another more atypical presentation is busying yourself to avoid the things that you're trying to not deal with.
Right.
But the problem with that is that when we push down our pain and we don't process it, we also push down our joy. And that leads to something called Anhedonia, which is a lack of joy and pleasure in things that once lit us up.
So you said that when we push down our pain, we also push down our joy.
Yes.
How did the two correlate? I'm intrigued.
When you're avoiding feeling something, you don't want to feel. You avoid and you push. You like on an unconscious level or even conscious, you just don't want to feel at all. So you busy yourself. But when you distract yourself from feeling
at all, then you distract yourself from all feelings.
Correct.
Yeah, it's almost like you feel this numbness. And I often hear people describe depression, or even when I've been in long periods where I felt sad for, there's a feeling of numbness that you end up going through because you don't want to feel the pain. And then also if you don't want to feel one emotion, it kind of locks you off from everything else.
It does.
What would you say is the difference for someone, you know, trying to understand whether they're just sad or whether they're depressed? Like, how do you differentiate between the two?
Sadness is a typical human experience. But depression may feel very heavy. It may feel as if you can't get out of the fog. And the clinical depression, it has specific symptoms, you know, the one that we treat in the DSM-5, the Bible of Psychiatry. All of this plethora of symptoms. To have clinical depression, you have to meet criteria for at least 2 weeks or more of all of these different symptoms. And they have to lead you to have a lack of functioning or significant distress. What I'm finding with high-functioning depression is that you have people who have all of these symptoms of depression, but they're not breaking down. They're over-functioning. So there's no place for them in the diagnostic manual. There's no place for these people who are showing up, who are the rocks. And I thought, well, why are we waiting for them to break down? why don't we intervene before they break down?
Yeah.
And there's this renaissance in like physical health with longevity science. You hear a lot of people saying, let's catch heart disease before it happens. Let's catch osteoporosis. Let's use HRT to prevent all these issues in women, in terms of looking at the perimenopause and menopause. But there's nothing like that for mental health. And I want to change that. I want us to intervene before people break down, before their bodies give, before they develop unhealthy ways of soothing with their pain, like substances and overuse of technology and so forth.
What would you say are some self-reflective questions that people can ask themselves to really assess whether they, are going towards that or are actually in a depressive or high-functioning depressive state?
I think it's important to, number one, validate. So in my book, I talk about the 5 V's. And the reason that I use 5 is because most people have 5 fingers.
Yes.
Most of us do. And so if you imagine that, happiness and joy are built into our DNA as humans, right? We all have dopamine in our brains. We just forgot how to access joy. So I like to use the hand because I always say using one of these 5 V's that are evidence-based, joy is within reach. You just have to relearn how to access your joy.
Okay.
Because when you think about babies, and I treat small children, when they go around the floor and they're exploring the world as toddlers. They're tasting things, they're feeling, they're laughing. They don't need much to access joy. But as we get older, as we go through trauma, as we get distracted, as things happen to us, we lose touch of that ability to access joy easily. So the 5 V's help. And the first is validation. And what does that mean? It means acknowledging how you feel, no matter if it's perceived positive or perceived negative emotion. Accept it. And it's important, and it sounds cheesy, but if we don't acknowledge the pain, we can't acknowledge the joy.
Yeah.
And as humans, we need to know what's happening. When we don't know how we feel when things are uncertain, we're anxious. We don't feel present.
Yes.
We feel frustrated. We feel lost. So the first step is really validation.
Okay. And do you want to go through the other V's?
Yes.
Yeah, please. I would love to hear them.
And the second is venting. So if you imagine venting is a physics term where air is trapped. And then when you release that, then the pressure goes down. So when we express how we feel, then that allows that, that's why when you go to therapy, sometimes you feel good.
Yeah.
But not everyone is a verbal, expresser. And I work with a lot of neurodivergent clients.
Right.
And so not everyone feels that it's easy to verbally express. So there are other ways. With the artists that I work with, they dance, they sing, they paint. Others like to write in journals to express. Others cry. I know your podcast, the name infers that crying is good for you, but there's science behind that. When you cry, you really let out these hormones and you feel better. That's why we have tear ducts, not just to moisten our eyes so that they stay functioning, but also so that we can release, that angst at times, that pain. So venting is very important. And then the third is the values. And I often say that values are things that are priceless, right? Not price tags.
Yes.
And I like my fancy things, but at the end of the day, when I'm on my deathbed, I'm not going to be like, I want, another Birkin, right? I usually say Prada, but I went with the Birkin this time. But the things that bring you purpose and meaning in life, like your family, your faith, the causes that you believe in, things like nature, these are priceless. So tap into that as much as you can daily. Yes.
Yeah, it was so interesting. Recently, I was talking to a friend and we were talking about the fact that he feels like people don't value him. And I said, you know what? I reflected on it and I was like, unless you have values, people don't know how to value you. And, growing up, I had specific things that I was really attached to. I was like, I love animals and that's something I really value. I know I don't want to drink alcohol. So I know that that's one of my values. And so as I grew up, these values actually ended up also forming how people saw me. And they saw when I valued something, it created a sense of value in their mind of me. But if you don't find the values that you have and you don't know them, it's not only difficult for you to value yourself, it actually reflects on how other people also value you. And so I really appreciated that when I read that in your book, because I was really thinking about it this week and I was like, if you don't have values, then other people also don't know how to value you because they don't see that through you.
Yeah, well, I talk about with my own personal journey, I grew up in a pastor's home, a spiritual home, yes.
Okay.
And we would often help the community. We'd go out and we used to complain about it as kids, but now I'm so grateful.
Yes.
But every weekend we spent so much time helping people in the community, be it like the YMCA or like a retirement home. I went into medicine to help people, but then, the accolades got in the way, going to Ivy League institutions, getting another degree, opening a lab, getting the right studies, being competitive. And then after a while, I found myself feeling very empty and lost.
Interesting.
And I had to tap back into, well, what fed me, spiritually? And it was being connected to people. I'm one of 4 siblings. I like to be in a team.
Yes.
Even my team in my lab, I was losing sight of feeling connected because I was so chasing the clout.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I tapped into, okay, what's really important, feeling connected to my community, that grounded me. And at the time I was going through a divorce and I realized, I was chasing these things that I'm not going to be on my deathbed thinking, oh, I wish I got a JD on top of the MD MBA, right? I'm going to be like, I wish I spent more time helping people and being connected with people, right? And that just shifted my approach. I had to tap into values as well. And I'm a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
So if it doesn't come naturally to me, imagine how many people out there just need that reminder.
Yeah.
So I have all these tools in my book just to help people find their way back to, the values based on what I've done in my clinical practice over the years, because a lot of people forget their past because of trauma.
Yes.
They don't realize that memories get buried. So people will say, well, I don't remember what it was like. I don't remember what I valued as a kid. And then you trace back and you realize there was a trauma. Maybe it was their own parents' divorce. Maybe there was a loss.
Yes.
Maybe something bad happened to them, in school or with their friend group. And they just don't remember what it was like to be lit up by something that brought them purpose. So there are all these tools in that book to really help people find their values again.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Where no matter what stage of life you're in, even for you, the theory. It's like doctors, even if they're treating patients for their health, if they've got heart disease or whatever, it's like theoretically we know what's right. And so for you, theoretically, you knew what you should be doing or had or needed to be happy. But there's one thing about theory, and then there's another part to it is practice. I just find it so fascinating that in every stage of life, whether it's like celebrities wanting to get more and more in life, whether it's you as a doctor who's got all these incredible degrees and being able to help people so much, or even if I think of myself, it's like, okay, cool, I get to help people with their health or through what they're cooking. But when you attach to the wrong things, it completely takes away the benefits you think you're going to get. Like when you attach to the wrong things, nothing feels valuable. So yeah, I guess connecting to your values is such a core principle to actually feel content and satisfied in life.
I love your use of the word attached, because when we think of attached, we think of attachment to others.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. You can attach to the wrong value set. Yes. And you think that you're doing the right thing because everyone else told you, but you're not being authentic to yourself, right? And so really examining what gives, I use these very primitive terms, full and fed.
Oh yeah, because, I like that. Full and fed, right. I can relate to that.
Because some people don't know, they've again pushed their own feelings. So I said, well, think about feeling full and fed and whole and satisfied spiritually.
I was going to ask, what do you think are ways if people don't feel like they understand their values? Are there questions they can ask themselves, or how do you get to the point of understanding what your values truly are?
I have a ton of tools that I use because, you said that doctors don't follow their own advice. Doctors are some of the most depressed people. There's high rates of suicide within residents. Yeah. And doctors tend to have poor health because they're so busy looking after their patients that they don't look after themselves. Yeah. And they're the people that are least likely to catch high functioning depression because it's like looking in the mirror, right? Because they're over-functioning, over-performing. They're not dealing with their own pain. Yes. So they're like, oh, come back when you're broken, because that's what they're used to. They identify as being healers, not preventers, right? But the ways that I ask people to tap into their values is sometimes we'll go through a trip down memory lane and we'll go to a memory that was the last memory that they can retrieve where they're actually feeling full and fed. And then we try to figure out what happened at that time, or if they really can't access the memory because of trauma and the brain pushed it down. I have other exercises where I say, well, if you had one person that you could have dinner with, anyone, they may say, oh, Jimi Hendrix, right? And it's like, oh, I wonder why. Because the person is not an artist, but why Jimi Hendrix? Well, because, he was doing things for a Black man at that time that were so cutting edge. Right. And then you realize, oh, so you're into innovation. So is that something that you used to value? And then the person goes, oh yeah, when I was younger, I used to tinker a lot. I don't do that anymore. So with that individual, I'll say, okay, well, let's slowly expose you to tinkering again, experimenting again. Maybe the first day you look up online robotics, right? And then the second day you look up a class. And maybe the next week you walk by the class, you peek in. Or maybe you don't. Maybe the following week you look at a video online, right? And you take baby steps back to things that the person valued. Another example I have is someone who, was in a city and she was feeling anhedonic. And it turned out that one of her core memories was built in a time when her family was together. And she didn't remember what she valued. She was in a busy, big city, important position. But then we realized that she worked, with her family, she'd go camping a lot. And she didn't have access to nature. So we had to work our way back into nature. And she felt full and fed again.
Really?
It wasn't like she was cured, but at least the
she
little
saw a glimpse
steps.
of it.
Correct. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So we've got validation, values. Oh no, there was one before that. Validation, venting, values. And then there's 2 more V's,
and
right?
And then there's vitals. I always say to my daughter every night, there is only one you. There will only ever be one you. You are so special. And I tell my patients this too. And it's such a game changer for people who feel lost, right? Because many people are like, why am I here? Well, think about the chances of the universe making it so that you exist, because there will only ever be one you.
Yeah.
And that sense of awe is so important. So what do you have to do since there's only one you? You got to take care of your body.
Yes.
You have a body and brain. You'll only get one. Yet we haven't figured out the science.
Yeah.
One day we will, but right now we haven't. So take care of your body and brain.
Yes.
And within the vitals section, I have the traditional things, that a doctor will tell you, like sleep, movement, eating nutritious foods that feed your brain and body. But also there are things that we need to take care of our body in terms of, technology. We don't know the long-term effects of technology exposure on the adult brain. We know a lot about children. So, set healthy boundaries with your work, with technology. And also the number one predictor of longevity is relationships. So don't discount the quality of your relationships. A toxic person will drain your life force,
Yes.
So within vitals, there's a lot, right? I don't want people to get overwhelmed, but just pick 1 or 2. And then the 5th is vision.
Okay.
Because when we're so busy accomplishing and checking off the boxes, we're on to the next, right? I'm guilty of this as well. But celebrate your wins. So like for you, for example, after this podcast, celebrating a win can be having a sip of tea or just like observing nature and saying, wow, I did that. That was hard. Like I interviewed guests and I listened and I validated and, I had to take it in.
Yeah.
And, I should really reward myself for that, right? So celebrating the wins in today because tomorrow is not promised. And then, planning joy in the future because that keeps you moving forward instead of getting stuck in the past.
Oh, that's nice. Planning joy in the future. That's so true. And I think people get so used to having such monotonous days where they feel like every single day is the same. But actually, if you observe, so many different things can happen in the day that you're not even realizing because you are stuck in that robotic behavior. So imagine celebrating in different ways every single day, even if it is you doing the same thing every day. There's so much satisfaction and power that comes with consistency. And that should also be rewarded. It's like, wow, you showed up to work 7 days today, or like you showed up to work for the past 20 years without taking a break. Like there's so many things to be celebrated that people take for granted in themselves.
Yeah.
And I think having that mood is so important because otherwise you also don't appreciate the things that you're doing in your own life or yourself in that way.
Yeah, I mean, today was a very busy day for me.
Yeah.
LA is hard to get around.
It is,
but I know that I'm going to get a massage when I get to the airport and I'm going to treat myself. But it doesn't have to be monetary, right?
No.
It could be as small as getting your kid to school on time. Like that's a struggle for me too.
Exactly.
Right? So after I get my daughter to school on time, I'm like, wow, that was hard. I'm going to sit in my living room and enjoy my coffee and just savor it instead of
gulping it down,
and then leaving and going to work, right?
Yeah.
So it could be the simple things, It doesn't have to be grand.
So true. What are some of the lesser known signs of depression that people often overlook?
Anhedonia is a term that's been in the medical literature since the 1800s.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it was the first time I actually heard of it when I read your book.
You know what's surprising is that I went to a therapy conference recently and I asked these top psychologists in the world and therapists what anhedonia was. And they were like, I don't remember,
Oh, interesting.
And I was like, wow. So if therapists don't know to ask you about it, then this is a symptom that's being overlooked.
Right.
And I think it's such a common experience to feel like meh or blah.
Like the feeling of blah, right?
Yeah, checked out, not really feeling much.
Yeah.
Because we are so muted in terms of accessing joy these days. There's so many distractions, right? We're constantly on the phone.
Yeah.
We're getting our dopamine hits. And what happens is that after a while, your brain gets so accustomed to all these hits that you don't access joy in more, stimulating ways, such as through connection with others, through being outside, through eating food and not looking at a screen. Something as simple as that.
Yes.
Some of us can't even go to the bathroom without looking at a screen.
It's so true. Yes, I can definitely put my hand up to that. I'm like, I should just leave my phone outside. Why am I taking it with me? Also gross. Like,
right?
No need.
Imagine the germs.
Yeah.
But yeah, these are simple things like when you're with your pet, if you're like on your phone, your pet is like not getting that full experience,
you're
right?
not having that full cycle of connection, like the exchange that actually fuels both people in that interaction.
Yeah, and I often say that like anhedonia is contagious. If there's a leader, and we've all had bosses that, they weren't happy, and then we all weren't happy as a result, right? The same way anhedonia is contagious, joy is contagious. So if you can, rejuvenate your organization with a bit of joy, you'll see people coming in feeling more energized, not just about work, but about seeing each other. And that's why it's important. It's a very sneaky symptom. I say that depression is like twin sisters. They're fraternal. They're not identical on the outside. So one is, weepy and crying and in bed, and the other sister is just muted, right? But who gets the attention? The one who's weepy. The one who's muted. At least they're not in crisis. But that's the mistake we're making in the healthcare industry, is that we're not really addressing, things like anhedonia, which are markers for other things like depression, trauma, substance use, schizophrenia. We have to address the lack of joy, not just be about like eradicating depression, but cultivating joy.
It's so interesting because I guess on one hand, you've got the high functioning where they're loud, they're present, you notice them, and I imagine you notice them in a room, they're very noticeable. And then you've got this other side, which is, how do you say Anhedonia? Anhedonia, where actually they're just quiet and in the background. And it just shows that there's such a spectrum of depression, or what symptoms you can have of depression, where we have to be so much more observant of the people around us. Because, I've had so many circumstances where they were like, we had no idea that person was suffering. We had a friend who passed away and had like drugs in their system. No one knew they were taking drugs. We people who were in the limelight and then suddenly committed suicide, and you were thinking, oh my gosh, they were just dancing and singing. What happened to that person? And so I guess a big part of it also, I was just thinking of the question of how can people who are maybe around someone who seems to be presenting with depressive symptoms, how can they help that person? Like, what can we do for that person?
Well, I'm sorry about your friend who passed. And, I've heard so many stories like that where people are wearing a mask of productivity, especially in the entertainment industry, in the arts, where you can't show up to an audition and be sad because you won't get the gig, right? So you're kind of stuck being happy, forced happy, performing, and no one knows you're struggling. And, what I would ask about, my goal is to really make the word anhedonia known. So when you have someone who's the rock, who's always on the go, who doesn't seem to need your help, or who's masking a lot, I would ask about anhedonia. I would say like, there's a term called anhedonia where you may be doing things that you used to love, but now you're just going through the motions. You're going just to perform. But when you go home, you're not really happy, I would ask them about that, and help them to get back into their body and not judge them. Because the other thing about people with high functioning depression is that they tend to people please. I say there are 3 risk factors: trauma, unprocessed trauma, anhedonia, right? Not feeling joy. And then something I call masochism, which used to be in the Bible of Psychiatry. They took it out. Now it's known as people pleasing, where you don't want to disappoint others. You bend over backwards. You perform even though you don't want to, right? So those are the hallmarks. So these are people who don't want to tell you that they're struggling. They feel guilty when they ask for help. They feel ungrateful when they slow down, right? Let them know that you're there no matter what. And then don't wait for them to ask. If you see they're not eating well, bring some food over. If you see that they're isolating, just sit with them. If you see they're overperforming, they're constantly busy, allow them to slow down. Say, hey, we could just chill. We don't got to do this and that, When people feel seen, they change. They feel as if, they don't have to do these things. They don't have to mask. They can show their real selves. And just realize that this is likely coming from a place of trauma. And trauma in itself makes people feel shame.
Yeah.
When people are traumatized and bad things have happened, they internalize blame. It's our way of controlling the world. And so our children, when something bad happens, they think they have magical thinking like, well, maybe if I had done my homework well, daddy would have stayed.
Yeah.
Or like, this grandpa wouldn't have died, right? And that magical thinking carries into adulthood for some with unprocessed trauma. They internalize that shame and blame. Well, maybe if I were like this, maybe if I did things differently, and then they don't ask for help. So don't wait for them. Be there even when they don't look like they need help.
I actually recently watched Trevor Noah talking about this on stage. I don't know where he was, but he was saying that one of his favorite things to do with his friends, because he was noticing that, maybe they weren't sharing as much. Now, every time he meets with his friends, they ask each other, like, what are you struggling with? And the fact is that question isn't asked enough. Like, what do you need help with right now? How are you feeling right now? Like, even the simple question of actually sitting down, not like, hey, how are you? But like, how are you feeling right now? What are you struggling with? And I think those questions, we're so used to having fun with friends and hanging out with them, and kind of, it can get quite surface level quite easily. And you feel like you're close because you see each other often, but are you asking the right questions? And so he said, I can't remember exactly what he asked, but it was essentially along the lines of, let's all go around the circle and say what we're struggling with. Because not only does that bring us closer together, we also get to understand how we can help one another. Like, in this group of people that we have as friends, are we here to just have fun, or are we here to actually support one another? And I thought that was really beautiful, because I think it's so easy to avoid those conversations. And, you show up to your friend group, and a lot of the time, with girls and with guys, you want to show up as like, I'm doing well, my work's good, my family's good, my girlfriend's good, like everything is good.
Yes.
And I think you want to show up as being this version of yourself, especially if people have perceived you in that way for a long period. So and I think that's even harder, like when people seem like they've got it good and people have that perception, almost breaking that, you feel like you're breaking their identity of you and you're showing up as weak.
Yeah.
And so you can continue that for such a long period until there's a breaking point. And so just asking questions to your friends, like anybody listening, when was the last time you asked some of your closest friends, what are you struggling with right now? What can I help you with? And I think having that as regular conversation topics is so important. And could probably save someone. Like, I always think about that one conversation, that one smile, that one interaction, that one genuine connection, that one moment where you just sat with someone for 5 minutes longer. You have no idea how much it could be saving the other person.
If you think about that person in your friend group, maybe they can't do that in front of a group.
Yes.
Maybe they have to do it privately. So for that individual, it may be a walk, right?
Yes.
Come with me on a walk, and we don't have to say anything, and let's observe nature. And let's just like let it flow organically like that. Sometimes people, they don't want to talk at all. So it could be going to a gallery and looking at different art. Right? Everyone's so different. And just showing up in the way that person can accept it, so that they don't feel that added pressure. Because sometimes, we do things, we want to help, but then we're like prying it out of the person. They're like, well, I wish I never said anything, And that's where, therapy is just so delicate. When you go to a therapist, therapists don't pull it out of you. They're on this process with you. So when you think about working with a friend who doesn't share, try to figure out the way that they can best communicate it that feels authentic to them, so they don't feel too exposed, but just be empathic.
From all the research you've done on depression, what have been some of the most shocking things that you found out, or things that you weren't expecting?
With depression, I always knew that women were twice as likely to have depression.
Is it twice as likely?
Twice as likely to have depression and anxiety compared to men.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating?
It is fascinating, because I also thought that women had a higher emotional capacity, and the capacity to receive pain, to endure pain, to turn pain into goodness. Like, in my mind, I thought women are just so built for resistance and adversity that I wasn't expecting it to be that high. Yeah. I kind of thought it would be the other way around, honestly.
I think you're right in that we can take on more. We don't show as much. But with the actual stats, we are more likely to have depression and anxiety, twice as likely. But men are more likely to die by suicide, right? So that's the difference. The suicide is what people take seriously, right? And they should. That is a crisis. Yeah. But the fact that many of us are walking around, pushing through pain, right? This book is for women. specifically too, because they tend to push through pain all their lives. Think about when you first got your period, right?
Yes.
You were told everyone gets it. I have 2 sisters, so 3 of us. Everyone gets it. So you should be fine. Even though you're like taking a, algebra test and you're in excruciating cramps and you're like, well, push through it. And you have cheerleader practice afterwards,
Yes.
And then you think about like PMDD, which is the premenstrual mood issues that some women have, right? They're told, well, why do you have to like take off from work? Because every woman gets their period, right? And then postpartum depression, well, women give birth, like my mom had 5 kids. And it's like, but did you know 80% of women have the blues? Like, what's up with that, And then perimenopause and menopause, our hormones, they make us more vulnerable. And there's only one psychiatrist for every 30,000 people in this country in some part. So I thought, why are we keeping this science to ourselves? Like, why are we being greedy and stingy with it? So in my book, I talk about things that I learned as a medical student that we write up when we see you, but we don't share it. So like, I want everyone to learn to understand the science of their own happiness. So know the science of your happiness, because the science of your happiness is not the same as mine. Even though we're both women, right?
Yes.
We have different experiences. We all have a biopsychosocial, it's a Venn diagram, but our experiences within the biopsychosocial are different. So there's an exercise in the book where you can actually circle your biopsychosocial and look at your biological risk factors. So as women, we go through changes once a month, right?
Yeah, too often.
Right. And we also may have medical issues. Like I have low thyroid, puts me at risk for depression, anxiety. You may have medical issues that put you at risk, or your family history. And then psychologically, you have different trauma than I do, maybe different attachment styles, who knows, maybe similar, different resiliency factors. But within that, understand it. Personally, I came to this country when I was very small. We had very little. So that scarcity trauma drives a lot of my high functioning depression, right? And then socially, I live in New York. You live in California. We have different surroundings.
Yes.
We have different jobs. I'm a single mom. I have a busy business. There are a lot of stressors. But then think about things in your social life, like your relationships, your work environment, how much you're drinking, or, the foods you eat. We all have our own biopsychosocial. And so I recently gave a talk to like 300 women, and I had them draw their biopsychosocials, and they were all so different, right? We're all humans, right? We all have the DNA to have joy, but our joy is going to be different based on our experiences. So understand the science of your own happiness, and then you can use the tools. That's why so many people, they read a book, they watch something on social media, and they're like, well, I tried that, it didn't work for me. But did you understand the science of your happiness? Because how are you using these tools when you don't even understand yourself?
Right.
So I wanted to democratize that. And yes, one of the things that I found was that women tend to push through pain. And in my research, caregivers, they're the ones that are feeling overwhelmed, right?
Oh, yeah, I imagine.
Because they can't stop, Ask any mom who's busy, who has a working...
Yeah, they don't have a choice. It's not
a
choice that they're making.
Yes.
It's just they have to show up.
So even though they want to shut down, they can't.
How can someone create moments of joy when they feel overwhelmed by sadness? Like what, you've been talking about joy so much and the science of your own joy. What are some of the things that you found have been known to bring joy to people? Like without fail, if you do this can probably bring you some joy in your life. Well,
I go back to the 5 V's, right?
Okay, yes.
Because I don't tell people to do all 5 at once, because people will get overwhelmed, deflated, and feel like they give up. It's similar when you see these skin routines and you're like, I cannot do all that.
Yeah, it's so true. And also my skin does not look like that when I do that routine. Yeah.
I saw a video of a woman who was like wrapped from head to toe, and I'm like, no.
There's no time for that.
No. But so do 1 or 2 a day if possible. Tap into 1 or 2 of the V's.
Yes.
It's so interesting because I have this research lab that's very scientific, and then I have the happiness lab that's really my passion projects, right?
Yeah.
And so when people come to the happiness lab, they're like, I just want to be happy. When people come to the research lab, we're trying to eradicate depression. So there's this disconnect between the real world and research. So it's a reframe, right?
Right.
When I ask patients who come to therapy, what is happiness for you? It's all a list of things. It's ideas, right? When I get that, job that I want, that partner, that house, the stuff, this idea of happiness. Whereas when you think of happiness in the research, you don't find that word happy. You find points that make up pleasure, right? So when you are hungry, did you savor your food? When you were lonely, did you feel connected to someone?
Interesting.
When you were with people, did you enjoy the interactions? When you got dressed for the day, did you feel pride in the way that you looked, right? So joy is this plethora of sensations that you experience, whereas happiness is this idea that you're trying to achieve. But the science shows that when you get the thing that makes you happy, you're still not happy, you're still chasing.
Right.
So it's a reframe. Try to get as many points of joy in a day. So think about it as, okay, today I got 2 points. Tomorrow maybe I'll get 3 points.
Right.
And maybe the next day I'll get 0 points, but I can always make it up the next day, right? Versus I just want to be happy. Because if you are pushing to become happy, you're likely not going to get happy when you get that thing that you think will make you happy, right? But try to increase your points of joy every day. So when you're having your tea, you're sipping your tea, you're tasting the herbs, you're feeling it go down, you're feeling relaxed versus I'm on my phone shopping while having my tea. Try to be present in these physiological things that makes being human human.
Yeah,
right?
I was just about to say, it sounds so much like the underlying thing you're saying is presence.
Yes.
Like create more moments of presence.
Yes.
Because if you're not present, you don't recognize the moments of joy. You're not actually present for them. You're not able to identify that this is a point in time where I can feel joy because you're constantly torn in different directions.
You are.
I wanted to ask, what is something people don't realize contribute to their mood and depression in a negative way? Like, one thing I loved in your book was the idea of like seeing no evil, hearing no evil, and speaking no evil. And I think people don't realize how much of a difference those things make, like what you're allowing into your senses.
We're always absorbing. And there was this old thought that, okay, once you're 25, your brain's fully developed, off you go.
Really? I didn't even know that.
Well, I mean, it's largely true that your brain forms by the time you're 25, but there's something called neuroplasticity where you're constantly changing. That's why the brain of an 80-year-old is not the same as a 25-year-old, right?
Yes.
And so because you're constantly changing based on your surrounding, you need to surround yourself with things that feed you, right? So if you're around people who are negative, who are talking about others, gossip can be fun, but it can also get really dirty. If you're constantly seeing things that are not pleasing to you, that aren't feeding you, right? You're in front of a screen or you're in, a place with no light or things that are not beautiful, then you're not getting that stimulation.
Yes.
If you're saying things that are negative, you're speaking into existence these things that actually do impact you, then that's all changing the way that you think.
So true.
And there's some emerging research that shows that when you're around people who are positive and motivated, you become that way.
Yes.
Just like when you're around people who are draining and toxic, you become that way.
Yeah.
So don't discount the value, the quality of your relationships because the longevity science is showing that's the number one predictor, right? That's why loneliness is as dangerous as smoking cigarettes.
Yeah.
So think about who you're around all day long. Really, think about the top 3 people. And if there are people who are dragging you down, you have to think about what you're going to do.
Yeah, I feel like we absorb so much more than we think.
We do.
It's not just the food that you're eating. Every single thing that you allow into your senses is being absorbed into you and becoming you. And so the words, the things that you're watching, the things that you're smelling, the things that you're seeing, every single thing is becoming you.
Yeah.
So if there's an imbalance of the things that are nourishing you versus the things that are draining or taking from you, you're constantly going to see that tip in the way that you're acting, feeling, and living.
Yeah. And when you're too busy to really take stock of your relationships, there are many people who are in romantic relationships that are toxic, but they're like, well, I'll just work on, something else. And maybe they can't get out of it. It's not so easy, financial reasons. Maybe it's not safe. But this all impacts you, right?
It does.
And so everyone has their own unique challenges. But when you're too busy to reflect, then you can go a decade and be with the wrong person, right?
Yes.
The wrong friend, the wrong job. So it's important to slow down. When you're a human being instead of a human doing, you see more.
Yeah.
You do, because we only get one life, right?
Yeah.
So slow down.
Be present.
Yes.
I loved how in your book you talked about expanding your vocabulary.
Yes.
The idea of like when you're feeling a certain way, and I've been thinking about this a lot since I read the book, where, okay, am I sad or am I this, and this? Am I angry or am I frustrated? Am I jarred? Am I whatever it is? Like trying to really understand your emotions also comes with trying to create a better vocabulary for it. Many people are used to feeling sad, angry, or happy. Like, do we know any of the other terms in between? And I think that helps to identify what you're actually feeling versus having an overarching name for it where you actually can't identify what that is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a psychological term called affect labeling. When humans know what's going on, they're less anxious. So think of 2020. We didn't know what was going to happen. The uncertainty was so frustrating and scary for us, and many of us couldn't sleep. When we don't know how we feel, the same thing happens. So it's as if you're in a dark room and something falls and you're like swinging because you're like afraid.
Right.
You turn the light on and like, maybe a picture frame fell, you just put it back up, right?
Yeah.
The same with emotion. So if you can pinpoint how you feel, you're less anxious about it. You know what to do about that feeling, So, feeling embarrassed versus frustrated.
Yes.
That's very different feelings. But for some who don't validate how they feel, they may not know the difference. So they're just like, well, why am I feeling this way? And then it's like, well, were you embarrassed? And it's like, I was embarrassed.
Yeah. That's so true.
I wonder why that embarrassed me. I wonder why I felt shame. And then you can go from there.
That's a great analogy. Yeah. It's when you don't know something, you're so much more scared of it.
Yes.
And it makes you so much more fearful without identifying or labeling what it is.
And impacts your behavior. You may shut down. You may avoid,
Yes.
You may get angry. You may react. But knowing how you feel allows you to then take the right course.
Is there anything from your research or your book that if they weren't to read the book, if they're only listening to this podcast and they get this far, what's one thing that you'd want someone to take away with them in their life and put into practice?
You are the only you that will ever exist. Ever. Right? I mean, that always gives me chills. So understand the science of your happiness. What's your path? What's your experience? What's your biopsychosocial? Understand you first. And then apply the tools. Then you'll get further, right? We all know that when we're uncertain, when we don't know what we're dealing with, we're lost. We're trying things that don't work. And then we're getting frustrated. And then we try things that, can actually harm us, right? So understand the science of your happiness. It's the best gift that you can give to yourself.
Yes. Oh my God, thank you so much.